family-owned banks, super low taxes, and bankers that are happy to onboard foreign non-residents. Plus, required deposits here are half of what you're going to find in other parts of Europe. But this isn't your standard European banking hub. And just because you can bank here doesn't mean you should, because this tiny country has its dark side, at least when it comes to banking. And in today's video, I'm going to be pulling back the curtain, sharing which country I'm talking about, the 3 challenges you need to avoid if you do decide to open a bank account here, and why most people, including you, should probably bank somewhere else. Though I will share the 2 times when it makes sense to bank here. So have you guessed which country I'm talking about? How about a few more clues? It's in Western Europe, uses the euro, but it isn't an EU member. It has its own official language, not English, not French, not German or Spanish. It's a favorite destination for foreigners who love cheap cigarettes and tax-free shopping. And every man in the country is required to own a gun. Plus, there are more ski resorts here than hospitals. I'm talking about Andorra, or the Principality of Andorra. It's parked in the Pyrenees Mountains between France and Spain. And like Europe's other 2 principalities, Liechtenstein and Monaco, Andorra has been trying to create a name for itself in the banking space. But unlike Monaco and Liechtenstein, which are both clearly private banking hubs, Andorra is tough to categorize. It's not really a private banking hub, but it's also not a retail banking hub. And while it has the kind of deposit requirements that you'd expect from premier banking, you don't get any of the premier banking benefits when opening here. So it's kind of a weird mix. Almost like it has a split personality. And while we don't generally suggest banking in Andorra, there are 2 times when it makes perfect sense to have an account here, which I will share with you after I cover the 3 challenges you need to avoid. But first, I also want to tell you why I'm covering Andorra. And it's because you asked for it. Maybe not you specifically, but Cesara2129, Oscar Martin 333, and Ramped 1437 did. And lots of other people have asked us to make videos on other countries as well, which is how we're prioritizing what to cover next. So if you have a country you want us to cover, just leave a comment below with the name of the country that you're interested in. The team will then tally up all the comments and tell me which country you want us to cover next. And now, let's talk about Andorran banking challenges. And while the first 2 challenges can be a concern in other countries, I haven't seen this 3rd challenge to the same degree anywhere else. But we'll get to that in a minute. First, let's get through challenge number 1 and challenge number 2. And challenge number 1 is insanely high fees. Now, like I said, fees can be a challenge in other countries, but Andorra takes fees to a completely different level, charging above market fees, in some cases 10 or even 20 times higher than the fees charged by other banks in other countries. We've had people tell us they feel completely ripped off by Andorran banks, getting charged over 500 euros for a single transfer from Germany. And other times, it can be a flat fee, say 2%, just to transfer funds into your Andorran bank account. And for context, private banks typically don't charge you anything for incoming transfers. And even retail and premier banks have low flat fees for incoming wires. So no matter how you look at it, 2% or 500 euros, that's a crazy high fee. Now, this is just one example, and not all banks charge fees at this level, and not all clients will have these fees imposed on their accounts. But if a fee is not 100% clear, or it's left ambiguous by the bank, there's a very good chance you're going to end up paying more than you expected. Fortunately, there's a really simple way to make sure you don't get stuck paying insane fees when banking in Andorra. And it all comes down to avoiding challenge number 3, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute, right after we cover challenge number 2, which is account freezes. And there's a reason why account freezes are a bigger issue in Andorra than other countries. It's because Andorran banks are hypersensitive. And my best guess here is they still have PTSD from the takedown of Banca Privada d'Andorra, or BPA. This was a textbook example of why you need to use banks that have strong compliance and onboarding practices, because BPA didn't. And as a result, they were a favorite institution for Russian, Chinese, and Venezuelan money launderers. And when the US found out, they moved in and had Andorran and Spanish authorities shut it down completely. Now, as a result, thousands of client accounts were effectively frozen with capped withdrawals, many of whom sued the Andorran government. And this was only 10 years ago. So all of the people operating in the Andorran banking industry right now, they remember this time very clearly. So they're extra careful, take extra precautions, and would rather deal with an upset customer than not follow the tightest compliance controls imaginable. And that's why you need to be aware of account freezes, investigations, and even account closures. The kind that stem from sending a transaction to a new party, receiving funds from a new country, or from sending a transfer that's larger than usual. In other words, the kind of account activity that wouldn't get your account frozen or even closed in another country. But it can cause problems for you if you decide to bank in Andorra. Fortunately, if you can solve the next challenge that I'm about to share, you shouldn't have to worry about random account freezes or closures. And challenge number 3 is a shortage of good bankers. Now, I've been talking to bankers in different parts of the world for over 20 years, so I have a pretty good radar for quality bankers. And I can usually predict how a conversation is going to go, whether I'm calling London, Hong Kong, Zurich, Singapore, Monaco, or Andorra la Vella. The bankers in Andorra, they're a bit more standoffish, less accommodating, less receptive, let's say unmotivated when compared to bankers that I speak to in other reputable banking jurisdictions, places like Switzerland or even Singapore. But there are always exceptions. And if you can find a good banker in Andorra, say a banker who picks up the phone, treats you fairly when it comes to fees, and actually helps you solve problems, then you might be able to avoid all 3 of these challenges. But again, finding that banker and avoiding these challenges is the hard part when banking here, which is why I prefer dealing with bankers in other banking hubs instead. And I know other people tell you Swiss bankers are snobby, Liechtenstein bankers don't pick up the phone. But that has not been my experience, far from it. These are professional banking hubs with professional bankers, many of whom have worked at some of the top banks in the world and even in different countries. And I think that helps explain why there's such a shortage of good quality bankers in Andorra. You see, Andorra is home to small banks, small Andorran banks. So you're not getting a lot of international influence. You won't find local offices for all of the big major banks from all over the world. The market's too small. And maybe this sort of professional isolation has created a certain attitude in the banking space, resulting in complacent bankers, and frankly, that's just not the kind of thing that most people want to deal with when it comes to their money. But like I said, there are 2 times when it can make sense to bank in Andorra, and I'm not joking. If either of these 2 scenarios apply to you or your situation, banking in Andorra can make a lot of sense. The first case is if you're applying for Andorran residency. And while I don't advocate for banking in Andorra, it does have a pretty interesting residency program that can be a lot more affordable than many other European options. Though it essentially requires you to live in Andorra for at least 6 months per year, which shouldn't be a problem because it's a beautiful spot with plenty of outdoor activities for you and your family. But if you're a city dweller and you don't really care about nature, this might not be the best option for you. Now, the second time it can make sense to bank here is if you have a complex structure, but you can't afford a high deposit. And there are 3 reasons for this. First, while I don't consider Andorra to be a private banking hub, the banks and bankers here do engage in private banking and wealth management. So they're going to be more familiar and comfortable with certain offshore holding companies, trusts, and foundations. Plus, as we've already discussed, Andorran banks require lower deposits than those in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Singapore, and even Hong Kong. But the bankers are still cautious. So if you have an offshore structure and you want to bank here, you'll need to choose the right country of incorporation or registration in the first place. And that's because Andorran bankers won't open accounts for companies from FATF or EU blacklisted jurisdictions. And they're even sensitive when it comes to unusual structures and unique sources of wealth. And one quick note here, my next video is all about choosing where to incorporate your entity. I'm even going to tell you 5 places you need to avoid and then 5 more places that you should consider instead. So if that's of interest to you, make sure you hit the subscribe button below so you get alerted when we publish that video. And now I want to tell you about one of my favorite banking hubs in Europe, home to some of the oldest banks in the world, bankers who actually pick up the phone, and surprisingly low deposits when you consider the quality that you get to access. To find out what country I'm talking about, you just need to click right here, and I'll tell you everything that you need to know about this European banking hub right now.